Okay, so now we know how to think about what combinations of leisure and consumption you can afford, right? We've thought about how to write down a budget constraint. So all we need to do now in order to find your optimal choice of leisure and consumption is to think about what your preferences should look like, right? Think about how we ought to write down a utility function and the difference curves to tell us which combinations of leisure and consumption you'll prefer to other combinations. And in order to do this, I want to remind you that leisure and consumption combine a whole bunch of different things. So the particular way that our preferences are going to look, right, the shape of our preferences, is going to depend on what particular things we're throwing into our, we value most as consumption, and what particular things we value most as leisure. So as an example, right, let's imagine that over winter break, you've kind of fallen down a rabbit hole, and at this point, the only thing you care about is streaming episodes of Survivor from Amazon, right? So the only thing you care about is Survivor. In order to stream an episode, it's going to cost you $1.99 and 1 hour of your time. So in this case, right, each unit of consumption of Survivor that you're able to get access to is going to cost you both in terms of consumption and also in terms of leisure, right? In particular, if this is the only way that you can get access to Survivor, and if Survivor is the only thing that you care about, then you'd expect that leisure and consumption are going to be perfect complements, right? They're only valuable to you when consumed in a perfect ratio, right? So your utility function for leisure and consumption is going to be a minimum function, right? What you care about is the number of episodes of Survivor. You get an episode of Survivor with 1 hour of leisure and with $2, right? So one episode is going to give you consumption over 2, right? So if all you care about is Survivor, these are the costs of Survivor episode. These are going to be your preferences for leisure and consumption. On the other hand, right, let's imagine that the only thing you care about is assembling IKEA furniture, right? You went on a shopping spree, you bought hundreds of armchairs and filing cabinets, you've got piles of stuff, and you've got to figure out how to put it all together. If you don't care at all about whether you assemble it or someone else assembles it, right, you do just as good a job as anyone else, right? We can imagine that each piece of IKEA furniture that you'd assemble would take you 3 hours, or would require you to hire somebody off of TaskRabbit or off the IKEA website for, let's say, $30. Who of course will do it in 20 minutes because they know they're done. Right? So in this case, are leisure and consumption going to be complements? Are they going to be substitutes? Something else? Well, now all you care about, your utility function, in terms of leisure and consumption, is just going to be, right, your well-being is going to depend on how many of these pieces of IKEA furniture you're able to assemble. So you'll assemble one piece every 3 hours, right, that you get in leisure. You'll assemble one piece every time you spend $30. Right? So you'll end up with a utility function like this. Leisure and consumption will be, in this case, perfect substitutes. Right? So the point here is that the way that leisure and consumption are going to be valued by you, right, both the relative value and also the curviness of your indifference curves, is going to depend on what specific thing is the highest and best use of your last hour, highest and best use of your last unit of consumption. Of course, in the real world, we expect that pretty much everyone has a whole range of different things that they like to buy, right? Stuff that they value, and has a whole range of different uses of their time that they also value. And that's going to be able to give us insight into what people's preferences for leisure and consumption ought to look like in general. The reason for this is, let's imagine that you've got lots of leisure, let's say 24 hours of leisure, and very little consumption, right? Let's say that you're stuck with just $2 a day. In this case, are you hiring someone else to assemble your IKEA furniture? Of course not, right? You're going to do that yourself because you've got lots and lots of time, very, very little money. So if you've got lots of leisure and very little consumption, we're going to expect you to do things with your money that you can't possibly substitute for leisure, right? Tasks like assembling IKEA furniture, cleaning your house, you're going to do entirely with leisure, you're not going to spend any money, right? You decide whether to take the bus or walk, you're going to walk. On the other hand, right, your consumption is going to be used only for things that can't be gotten by the expenditure of time, right? You're going to be buying groceries with consumption, things like dry beans and rice, right? You're going to be using your dollars maybe to buy yourself shelter or buy yourself medicine. So as a result, we're going to expect that when you've got lots of leisure and very little consumption, your last unit of leisure isn't worth very much to you relative to your last unit of consumption, right? Because you're doing stuff with your time that even a little bit of money could get you out of, right? You're spending an hour walking to save yourself $2 for the bus. So if we think about your willingness to trade leisure for consumption, you're going to be willing to trade a lot of leisure for a little consumption. Right? On the other hand, let's imagine that you've got 4 hours a day of leisure, and you've got, $600 a day of consumption. Right? You've got yourself an internship at Goldman Sachs. They're just working you really, really hard, but they're paying you really well. So in this case, the exact opposite is the case, right? You're definitely not assembling your own IKEA furniture in this situation, right? You're not going to do anything with your 4 hours off the clock that you could reasonably get by spending money, right? All of the time you're spending in leisure is spent on things that you really can't buy, things like sleep, right? Things like time eating. So over here, you're going to be willing to trade a lot of consumption for a little leisure. Right? And as a result of this, we expect your preferences, right? If we draw the difference curve, we expect it to be very steep here, very flat there, right? In order to give up a couple hours of leisure, you're going to need very little consumption over here, right? Let's say to give up 2 hours of leisure. You need maybe $2 extra over here. Up here, in order to give up 2 hours of your leisure, you need an extraordinary amount of consumption, right? You need to be paid hundreds of dollars an hour. So the point here is, right, we should really expect that for pretty much everybody, our indifference curves, when we're thinking about the trade-off between leisure and consumption, should bend in towards the origin, like this, right? The slope of our indifference curve should be a lot flatter when we have more leisure and less consumption, a lot steeper when we have more consumption and less leisure. We should expect people in general to prefer intermediate quantities, right? Moderate amounts of money and time, than to prefer extremes where they have lots of time and no money, or extremes where they've got lots of money and no time. And this is true both for the reason that we think that indifference curves for apples and bananas are going to look like this, right? People eventually get sick of eating apples, right? Eventually you get sick of caviar, you just want some sleep. Eventually you get sick of playing frisbee, you just want to eat something. But it's also going to be true because the actual tasks that people, the actual goods that people are getting by spending leisure and consumption can be got in multiple ways, right? So as we move towards having more leisure and less consumption, we're going to have more and more tasks done using time, right, spent using time, and fewer tasks that we accomplish using money. Now, just as a reminder, right, we're already hinting at this, the slope of our indifference curve has an important economic meaning, right? What it means to be indifferent between two choices, right, like point A here versus point B, is that A is just as good as point B. So if I can be just as happy at point B as point A, and to get to point A, I gave up 2 units of leisure, right, 2 hours of leisure, got $2 worth of consumption, that tells me that those 2 hours of leisure were worth $2 of consumption to me. Right, so the slope of my indifference curve is going to tell me how much consumption I'm willing to give for a unit of leisure right? An hour of leisure. We don't have to be cute here, right? Which is also going to tell me effectively the dollar value I placed on each hour of leisure. And as you might remember, we have a term for this, right, for the slope of our indifference curve at a particular point, which is our marginal rate of substitution, right, the rate at which we're willing to substitute consumption for leisure. Marginal rate of substitution, or MRS, calculated at some particular point, is going to be the value in terms of utility, right, of an hour of leisure over the value to me in terms of utility of a unit of consumption. Right? This makes sense? So we're saying the amount of consumption I'm willing to give up for an hour of leisure is the same as the dollar value to me of that hour of leisure, right? The amount that hour of leisure is worth to me in terms of dollars. And that's going to be calculated by saying, how much utility do I get for an incremental bit of leisure compared to how much utility do I get for an incremental unit of consumption, right? The more valuable leisure is, the more consumption I'm willing to give up. The more valuable consumption is to me, the more valuable consumption is to me, the less consumption I'm willing to give up to get an hour of leisure. Okay.